Every financial collapse is described as a surprise. That is the lie. The receipts usually exist long before the panic does. Budget ledgers that keep growing even when speeches promise restraint. Central bank balance sheets that swell in plain view because the alternative, at the time, looks worse. Debt tables that climb in small, forgettable steps until the sum becomes too large to picture. Today, those receipts are public. The United States is carrying a national debt measured in the tens of trillions. Over the last decade, the monetary base has expanded at speeds that once only appeared during wars or depressions. This is not hidden behavior. It is institutional paperwork, quietly accumulating year after year. A century earlier, the paperwork had a different shape, but the pattern rhymed. In the Weimar Republic, inflation turned prices into absurd numbers. By late 1923, a single loaf of bread could cost hundreds of billions of marks. Savings accounts did not disappear. They simply stopped buying life. In Argentina, at the start of the 21st century, the mechanics looked modern. Deposits were frozen. Withdrawals were limited. Dollar accounts were forcibly converted into local currency at rates set by decree. Legal ownership still existed on paper, but practical control vanished overnight. The language changed. The outcome did not. This is the first uncomfortable fact this film is built around. Most people do not lose everything in a collapse because they are reckless or uninformed. They lose everything because they follow behaviors that are rational inside a functioning system. They save in banks. They hold retirement accounts. They trust contracts because contracts have been honored for decades. They borrow against stable income because stable income has been the normal texture of life. Then the system crosses a line. At that moment, tactics stop behaving like tactics. They reveal themselves as assumptions. And assumptions are what collapses punish first. Afterward, explanations rush in. Someone must be blamed: a corrupt politician, a greedy banker, a reckless central bank. The story feels complete once a villain is named. But across history, the faces rotate while the structure remains. Leaders postpone pain because pain is punished immediately. Banks expand credit because expansion is rewarded in booms. Households borrow because borrowing is how you keep up when assets rise faster than wages. Each decision can be rational on its own. Together, they form a trap. Collapse is rarely a single event. It is a sequence that feels manageable until the final step removes the ability to manage it at all. This documentary is not a forecast with a countdown clock. It is an examination of a recurring machine, the way it advances through stages, and the way it quietly separates people into two groups when institutions stop keeping their promises. History does not repeat as a timeline. It repeats as an architecture. In Weimar, the numbers screamed. Workers were paid and rushed to spend before the money decayed again. Savers watched account balances remain unchanged while shrinking in the real world, loaf by loaf. In other collapses, the numbers are quieter. Value erodes over decades. Purchasing power drains slowly enough to be tolerated, until suddenly it is not. Different tempo, same destination. And inside that destination sits a paradox that returns every time. If collapse is a known pattern, why do so many people still lose everything? The answer is that most financial advice is tactical. It is optimized for a world where the plumbing holds. Banks clear payments, markets quote prices, courts enforce contracts, governments maintain the general idea of property rights. In a true systemic break, that environment disappears faster than tactics can adapt. Markets can close, banks can impose limits, governments can rewrite terms, courts can become secondary to emergency authority. The thing you believed you owned turns out to be a claim that requires institutions to perform precisely when those institutions are fighting for survival. What survives is not the clever trade. What survives is the principle underneath. A principle is a financial truth that does not depend on timing. It is rooted in needs that do not vanish when paper systems fail. When currency collapses, food still matters. When institutional trust breaks, trust between humans still functions. When contracts dissolve, skills still live inside the body. The core claim behind this film is blunt. Some people survive collapse, and some even improve their position, not because they predicted the moment, but because they positioned themselves in ways that remain valuable when the system stops cooperating. This is not about comfort. It is not about outperformance. Collapse survival is about reducing dependence. Dependence on paper claims that require third parties. Dependence on leverage that works only when income is stable. Dependence on distant institutions that may not be able to deliver under stress. In calm decades, claims feel identical to property. A deposit feels like money. A pension statement feels like security. A stock certificate feels like ownership. The difference is invisible because the institutions behind those claims are strong enough to make it invisible. Collapse is when that distinction becomes physical. You discover that money is also permission, that ownership is also enforcement, and that enforcement can be delayed, diluted, or denied when systems are strained. This is why the structure of this documentary matters. We are going to move through 5 principles that reappear across countries and centuries. Each principle will be treated as an artifact pulled from a collapsed system, not folklore. Mechanism, evidence, consequence. There will be no clean escape route at the end. Leaving a debt-based financial order is not like closing an account. The exits are expensive because the system is built on the assumption that most people cannot take them without destabilizing everything around them. But there will be a cognitive shift. You will learn to separate assets from claims, strategies from assumptions, stability that is earned from stability that is borrowed from the future. Because the collapse, whenever it arrives, is not a shock. It is the system behaving as designed. The first principle is brutal because it sounds too simple to matter. Yet, it is the one collapse returns to first. Hard assets survive. Paper burns. In calm years, paper feels solid. A bank statement prints in clean ink. A brokerage account shows numbers that rise and fall with the confidence of a machine. Contracts are signed, stamped, and stored. Contracts are signed, stamped, and stored. The system teaches you to trust symbols, because in normal times, symbols can be exchanged for reality on demand. Collapse is when demand arrives, and the system cannot meet it. In Weimar, the destruction was fast enough to be visible in a single morning. People did not wake up stupid. They woke up inside a currency that could not hold value long enough to cross a street. Prices did not rise because bread became rarer in 1 week. Prices rose because the unit used to measure bread lost integrity. You could still own 1,000,000 marks. You simply could not turn it into food before it decayed again. That is what paper is in a collapse. It is a claim on stability when stability is already gone. A farm does not care. A building does not care. A workshop does not care. The currency unit can change. The legal code can bend. The politicians can announce a new plan, and the wheat still grows. The roof still keeps rain out. The machines still turn raw material into something useful. This is not romantic. It is mechanical. Hard assets hold value in crisis because value becomes physical again. Food, shelter, fuel, tools, basic materials, productive land, durable infrastructure. These are not ideas. They are functions. When systems break, functions outrank promises. This is why collapse survivors often look boring in hindsight. They were not chasing the highest return. They were converting fragile claims into stubborn reality before the conversion became expensive or illegal. Then comes the subtle trap. Modern people hear hard assets and think of shiny objects, gold, silver, watches, collectibles. Those can work, but only inside a deeper logic. A hard asset is not defined by how it looks. It is defined by whether it retains usefulness when enforcement weakens. A bar of gold is portable and historically recognized. That matters. A property title can matter, but only if property rights are still enforced locally. A house can protect you, but only if you can keep it. A warehouse full of inventory can be wealth, but only if you can secure it and move it when supply chains fail. So the principle is not a shopping list. It is a filter. Ask a single question. If the financial system stopped functioning for a year, would this still matter? In stable times, the financial system adds a second layer of value. It turns ownership into liquidity. It turns production into financial products. It turns future earnings into present wealth. That layer is powerful, and it can accelerate entire societies. But it also creates a dangerous illusion. It convinces people that claims are the same thing as the thing claimed. In collapse, the illusion is removed. You are left with what you can use, defend, operate, and exchange without asking permission. That leads directly to the second principle, because people often learn the first one too late and still make the same mistake in a different form. Own productive assets, not speculative assets. Not all hard assets protect you. Some are just paper with extra steps. A speculative asset is valuable mainly because you expect someone else to pay more later. It might be physical, but it still depends on a buyer with confidence and spare capital. In a crisis, those buyers evaporate. They are not evil. They are trapped. Their liquidity is limited, their fear is high, and their priorities narrow. In that moment, the market stops being a market and becomes a triage line. A productive asset is different. It pays you an output, not opinion. A farm produces food. A rental property provides shelter. A small business provides a service. Equipment produces goods. A trade skill produces repairs. Even when markets freeze, people still need food, shelter, heat, transport, medicine, and maintenance. Productive assets plug into those needs. Speculative assets depend on mood. This difference explains why some collapses create a weird optical illusion. Sometimes, asset prices soar in nominal terms during hyperinflation. The stock index might explode upward. It can look like wealth is being created. But if the currency is collapsing, the index is only rising because the measuring stick is shrinking. The asset is not necessarily becoming more useful. It is just being priced in a unit that is dissolving. Meanwhile, the bakery that keeps producing bread is not impressed by the stock chart. It is measuring value in flour, heat, labor, and demand. Productive assets do not require a functioning market to matter. Markets help them scale and optimize, but the core value exists even when scale disappears. In every major downturn, the people who relied entirely on resale are the first to panic. They need liquidity. They need buyers. They need confidence to persist long enough to exit. Productive owners do not need to exit. They can ride it out by continuing to produce, continuing to collect rent if rent is still paid, continuing to trade output for necessities, continuing to adapt. They can become smaller, more local, less efficient, and still survive. Speculators can be brilliant and still lose everything if the system removes the ability to trade. That is why the second principle is not just about wealth. It is about dependency. Speculative wealth is dependency on liquid markets. Productive wealth is resilience inside a liquid reality. Now place these two principles inside the current American context described in the transcript. Most modern wealth sits in paper claims, bank deposits, retirement accounts, bonds, equities held through intermediaries, real estate held with leverage and optimized for appreciation. Even many people who believe they own hard assets discover they are holding debt with a house attached to it, or they are holding shares in a system that owns the house. In normal conditions, that structure performs. It is efficient, it is scalable, it is rewarded. In a true systemic break, the structure becomes a liability. The claims require enforcement. The liquidity requires markets. The leverage requires stable income. The entire machine assumes continuity. Continuity is what collapses remove. So the documentary slows here, because this is where most viewers will try to turn the principles into tactics. They will try to translate this into a quick allocation, a purchase, a trade. That impulse is understandable. It is also dangerous. It is the same impulse that gets wiped out. The desire for a single move, a single bet, a single perfect positioning. Principles are not a bet. They are a stance. The stance begins with an unglamorous truth. In collapse, the world stops rewarding cleverness and starts rewarding ownership of function. And the function that matters most is the ability to keep producing value without asking the system for permission. That is why the people who thrive in crisis are often not the loudest. They are the ones who quietly converted fragile claims into stubborn output. They did not win because they knew the date. They won because they stopped depending on a system that was already failing. The third principle is where collapses stop being abstract and become personal, because it touches the one lever modern societies use to turn ordinary lives into financial machines. Debt destroys you in collapse, even the kind that looked safe. In stable years, debt is sold as a tool. Borrow to buy a house, borrow to build a business, borrow to invest in education. In an expanding economy, this can feel rational, even responsible. The logic is clean. You exchange future income for present capability. The asset appreciates, the wage rises, the payment stays manageable, and time does the work. Collapse breaks the time assumption. It does not matter whether the debt was taken by a reckless gambler or a cautious family. When the environment changes, debt becomes a fixed obligation in a collapsing world. Your income becomes uncertain. The payment stays certain. The bank does not accept explanations. The contract is not designed for empathy. It is designed for enforcement. This is the hidden mechanism that turns downturns into dispossession events. In past collapses, you can watch it happen in stages. First, the economy slows. Demand falls. Prices in some sectors weaken. Employers cut hours before they cut jobs. Second, incomes become erratic. Not always zero, but unstable enough that planning becomes impossible. Third, credit tightens. Lenders become cautious. Refinancing becomes harder. Extensions become expensive. The escape doors close. Fourth, the debt remains. The obligation does not shrink in sympathy with the economy. The payment date continues to arrive like a metronome. Fifth, forced sales begin. People sell what they can to meet payments. The market floods. Prices drop. This is where paper wealth evaporates in a different way. Not inflation, but liquidation. Sixth, foreclosure becomes a mass event. Assets transfer to creditors or to buyers with liquidity. The system does what it is designed to do. It reallocates property to whoever can meet obligations. Seventh, the social narrative changes. It stops being about opportunity and becomes about survival. Debt that once felt normal begins to feel like a predator. Not because anyone is evil, but because a contract written for stability behaves like a trap in instability. This is why inflation alone does not automatically rescue debtors, even though the simplified argument sounds convincing. If the currency weakens, the real burden of debt can shrink. That is true under one condition. Your income must rise along with prices, and your access to the financial system must remain intact long enough to keep paying. In actual collapses, those conditions often fail. Wages lag, jobs disappear, governments impose controls, banks change terms, payment channels close. The debtor hears a new sentence that replaces every optimistic financial plan they were taught. Pay anyway. The transcript frames it sharply. If you own a house with a mortgage, you do not fully own the house. You are sharing ownership with a creditor who has priority over your future. In growth years, that priority feels invisible. In collapse, it becomes the first claim on your life. Debt-free ownership is not glamorous. It does not maximize returns. It does not scale fast. It does something far more important. It removes a countdown clock. If you have no debt, the crisis can still crush your income, still raise your costs, still destabilize your world, but it cannot legally compel you to sell your most essential assets on someone else's timeline. In collapse, timing is everything. And debt hands your timing to the creditor. This brings us to the fourth principle, because even if you own hard, productive assets and you have eliminated leverage, history still has one more way to humble you. States can seize, markets can close, borders can harden, capital controls can trap wealth behind legal walls. A person can do everything right and still be forced to move. When that happens, the only wealth that crosses borders without permission is the wealth embedded in the self. Skills are the only truly portable wealth. This idea sounds almost moral. It is not. It is strategic. Every other form of wealth depends on external recognition. Your property must be recognized by a state. Your deposits must be honored by a bank. Your shares must be recorded by an institution. Your gold must be protected, transported, and exchanged. Skills do not require recognition. They only require a market of human need. In extreme periods, the social hierarchy collapses and is rebuilt around function. Who can repair? Who can treat illness? Who can grow food? Who can build? Who can translate? Who can keep machines running when parts are scarce? Who can organize logistics when the old routes no longer work? These people gain leverage in every system, even hostile ones, because systems still need output. Even under authoritarian control, even under rationing, even under nationalization, the system cannot abolish the need for competence. This is why history is full of stories that confuse outsiders. Wealthy people who were safe on paper become fragile when their wealth depends on a world that no longer exists. Meanwhile, a craftsman with little savings rebuilds quickly because he can exchange competence for survival and then for opportunity. In stable societies, skill is monetized through salaries. In unstable societies, skill is monetized through access. Access to food, access to transport, access to shelter, access to networks, access to protection. Skills are portable because they travel inside the body. They can be carried through border crossings, through confiscation, through inflation, through bank closures, through the failure of paperwork. There is a second layer here, and it matters for modern America. Many people believe they have skills because they have credentials, a degree, a job title, a resume built inside a complex system. Collapse tests skills differently. A credential is a claim. A practical skill is a function. A function survives when the system shrinks. A claim can be rejected when the system is stressed. That is why the safest skills are those that produce value with minimal dependencies. Skills that do not require delicate supply chains. Skills that do not require institutional licensing in a country that may change its rules. Skills that can be traded locally, under pressure, and in perfect conditions. The transcript asks the viewer a hard question. Can you grow food, fix machines, provide medical care, build shelter? These are blunt examples, but the deeper point is broader. In collapse, the economy becomes less symbolic and more physical. The more physical your skill, the more direct your ability to convert effort into survival. Now, the fifth principle is the one modern people resist the most because it feels old, almost primitive, and because it reveals how much of modern safety is outsourced. Local trust networks outlast institutions. Institutions are engines of scale. They allow strangers to cooperate. They allow large societies to function without everyone personally knowing everyone else. That is their gift. It is also their fragility. When institutions fail, strangers do not suddenly become enemies. They become uncertain. They retreat. They conserve. They distrust the system and, by extension, the distant people inside it. At that point, the economy reverts toward the oldest infrastructure humans have ever used: relationship. In nearly every breakdown, people survive through informal networks: family, neighbors, religious communities, trade circles, mutual aid arrangements that do not appear on government spreadsheets. These networks provide information, security, logistics, and resource exchange when the official channels are compromised. The modern person often hears this and pictures charity. That is not the right frame. This is not about kindness. It is about redundancy. A local network reduces the number of single points of failure in your life. If the bank locks your account, you still have someone who can trade. If a store is empty, you still have someone who knows a supplier. If official services are delayed, you still have someone who can help. Networks convert loneliness into resilience. This is the part of the machine most people never model because normal life hides it. You can live a comfortable modern existence while barely knowing your neighbors. Your network becomes institutional. An employer, a bank, a supermarket, a delivery service, an insurance company, a police department. Each one works well until it does not. Then you discover the gap. Your survival infrastructure was outsourced to systems that are optimized for efficiency, not continuity under stress. The transcript draws a grim comparison. In many modern societies, people are institutionally connected and locally isolated. That combination works in peace and fails in rupture. Local trust networks are not a guarantee. They can fail too. But they are the last form of organization that tends to survive when everything else is questioned, because they are built from repeated interaction and mutual consequence. They do not require a national budget. They do not require a functioning payment rail. They do not require a court to enforce a contract between strangers. They require one thing: trust that has been earned before the crisis. That timing matters. You cannot build a network in a week after the failure begins. Not reliably, not at scale. By then, everyone else is also trying to build one, and trust cannot be rushed. So now we have the 5 principles, and the shape of the trap becomes clearer. Hard assets survive because value becomes physical again. Productive assets survive because output outranks opinion. Debt kills because it hands your timing to enforcement. Skills survive because they cross borders and systems without permission. Networks survive because relationships persist when institutions cannot. And notice what is missing. No specific stock, no perfect allocation, no single commodity that saves everyone, no promise that a clever tactic will outsmart a collapsing structure. That omission is the point, because in every collapse, the people who get wiped out are not the ones without information. They are often the ones who were overtrained to believe the system would remain continuous. They were taught to optimize for efficiency in a world where continuity was the hidden assumption. They were trained to treat paper claims as reality because, for decades, they behaved like reality. Then, the system corrected the misunderstanding. In the final moments before collapse becomes obvious, the most dangerous emotion is the desire for certainty. People wait for confirmation. They want an official announcement. They want a date. They want a clear signal that will justify the discomfort of changing their lives. Collapses do not give that gift. By the time certainty arrives, the conversion windows close. Capital controls appear. Liquidity evaporates. The public rush begins. The rush itself becomes a force that accelerates the breakdown. This is why principles matter more than tactics. Principles are not dependent on your ability to time panic. They are positioning choices that reduce vulnerability, regardless of whether the rupture arrives soon or later. But there is still one unanswered question, and it is the one that makes the documentary unsettling. If these principles are ancient, if they have appeared in collapse after collapse, and if they improve resilience even in stable years, why do societies keep reproducing the same fragility? The answer sits inside the incentive structure. Modern systems reward short-term performance. They reward leverage and booms. They reward financialization because it increases apparent wealth. They reward dependence because dependence produces reliable consumers and predictable taxpayers. They reward centralization because centralization is efficient. Resilience is the opposite of efficiency. Resilience looks like slack. It looks like redundancy. It looks like owning things outright instead of maximizing returns. It looks like learning skills that do not show up cleanly on a spreadsheet. It looks like building local networks that do not scale neatly. So resilience is underproduced, even when it is rational, because the system does not reward it until it is too late. And that is the grim symmetry of collapse. The system does not fail because people are evil. It fails because the incentives reward behavior that increases fragility until fragility becomes unavoidable. The next stage of this documentary will do something most collapse content avoids. It will stop treating these principles as slogans and start treating them as a sequence. Because the real question is not whether hard assets, skills, and networks matter. The question is how a modern society, built on paper claims and institutional trust, slides from stability into a stage where those things dominate again. Not suddenly, not theatrically, step by step, rationally, predictably. And once you see the stages, you stop looking for a headline to warn you. You start watching the infrastructure, because the infrastructure is where collapse begins, quietly, legally, on paper. Collapse has a mythology. It arrives like a storm. It strikes overnight. The old world ends in a single broadcast. That is not how it usually works. Most collapses move like a slow administrative disease, hidden inside paperwork, hidden inside temporary measures, hidden inside policies that make sense for the moment they are announced. People adapt. They normalize. They keep going. And then later, they discover that adaptation was the path that carried them into the trap. So to understand why these 5 principles keep winning, you have to understand the stages that keep producing the same losers. Not because history is dramatic, because systems are consistent. Here's the sequence. The same machine wearing different national uniforms. Stage 1 is confidence. The currency works, the institutions work. Savings live in banks, retirement lives in markets, payroll arrives on time, debts are serviced. The system becomes background noise. This stage is so quiet that no one calls it a stage. They call it normal. Stage 2 is pressure. The government faces obligations that are politically impossible to cut. Social spending, war spending, bailouts, demographic weight, debt service, a recession, a crisis. The details change with the century, but the structure does not. Officials do not wake up trying to destroy the currency. They wake up trying to keep the state functioning. If taxes cannot cover obligations, the state borrows. If borrowing becomes expensive, the state leans on the monetary system. If the monetary system expands, it buys time. Time is the product being purchased. Stage 3 is expansion. Credit grows faster than production. Asset prices rise faster than wages. People feel richer, but the richness is increasingly symbolic. The paper value of claims inflates. A house is no longer shelter plus location. It is also an asset whose price is expected to rise forever. A retirement account is no longer savings. It is a bet that markets will always remain liquid. A portfolio is no longer ownership. It is a collection of interlocking promises. This stage is where fragility is built, because expansion makes dependents feel smart. Leverage is rewarded. Those who borrow and buy assets look like visionaries. Those who refuse look like they missed the future. The system trains the public into the behavior that will later destroy them. Stage 4 is strain. This is the stage most people miss because it arrives as annoyance, not disaster. Prices rise faster than expected. Daily costs creep upward. Institutions become less reliable, then blame supply chains, then blame external shocks, then blame each other. The public feels uncertainty, but the numbers still work. In this stage, governments often use soft controls, subsidies to calm pain, temporary rules, quiet regulations, accounting changes, anything that preserves surface stability. It feels rational, and that is why it is dangerous. Stage 5 is containment. This is where the system starts revealing what it really is. When confidence weakens, the priority becomes preventing a run, preventing panic, preventing a spiral. And the fastest way to prevent a run is to restrict exits. Not always with soldiers, often with policy. Limits on withdrawals, restrictions on transfers, emergency measures that protect the financial system, changes in terms, forced conversions, new taxes on movement, new rules about what counts as legal tender. This is where people learn the difference between ownership and permission. They still have accounts, they just do not have control. Stage 6 is repricing. This is the acceleration point. The measuring stick breaks, or the market freezes, or both. In inflationary collapse, the currency falls and everything gets repriced upward, often violently. In deflationary collapse, credit contracts, asset prices fall, and forced sales destroy balance sheets. Sometimes the two interact, creating a world where necessities inflate while paper assets deflate. Either way, the old assumptions stop functioning. At this stage, tactics begin to fail in bulk. Portfolio theory collapses because correlations shift toward one. Diversification becomes a story people told themselves in the expansion phase. Safe instruments reveal counterparty risk, guaranteed. Pensions reveal political risk. Insured deposits reveal that insurance is also a promise made by the same state under strain. Stage 7 is reset. The reset can take many forms. A new currency, a redenomination, a restructuring, a default, a banking system reorganization, a new political settlement that rewrites the financial contract between citizen and state. To the public, it feels like collapse happened here at the end. But the collapse happened earlier, when the system quietly crossed the threshold where exits had to be contained to prevent immediate failure. This stage machine is why principles outlast tactics. Tactics assume a particular stage. Buy this when markets fall, hold that when inflation rises, move here when rates change. These can work inside certain phases, but they can fail catastrophically when the phase changes overnight. Principles are stage resistant. They do not require you to know which phase you are in. They are built around what remains valuable when the phase changes in the worst possible direction. Now we take the camera back to the 5 principles and watch how each one maps onto the stages. Hard assets survive, because in stage 6, repricing, paper claims become unstable, the currency moves, the market freezes. The thing that holds value is the thing that still functions. Productive assets survive because in stage 6, buyers disappear for speculative assets. But output still trades. The bakery still matters. The farm still matters. The repair shop still matters. Debt kills because in stage 5 and 6, containment and repricing, the system protects creditors and institutions. Individuals become the release valve. Debt forces liquidation at the exact moment liquidation is worst. Skills survive because in stage 7, reset, people move. Even when they do not physically move, the economy they knew is gone. Skills become the bridge into the new regime. Networks survive because in stage 4 through 7, institutions become unreliable, then coercive, then restructured. Local trust becomes the parallel system that fills the gaps. Once you see this stage logic, a second paradox emerges, deeper than the first. Why do people remain in paper claims and high leverage, even when the receipts are public? Because the system pays them to. In stage 3, expansion, paper claims are rewarded, asset prices rise. Debt makes you look smart. Local networks feel unnecessary. Practical skills feel inefficient. Hard assets look like dead weight. Everyone in the economy receives constant feedback that fragility is modern. Then stage 5 arrives and the feedback reverses. Suddenly fragility is punished. But by then, the behavior has already been trained into the population. Most people cannot pivot quickly because their entire life is optimized for the old environment. Their wealth is stored in claims. Their income is tied to institutions. Their community is thin. Their skills are specialized for systems that require scale and stability. This is not a moral failure. It is incentive success. So now the documentary turns from history to intimacy. Because if you want the viewer to feel the weight of the machine, you have to show what it does to a single household. Picture the normal modern plan. A family holds its savings in a bank. Retirement is in market funds. The home is owned with a mortgage. The monthly budget is balanced on predictable income. Insurance exists for emergencies. Credit exists for flexibility. Food comes from a supermarket whose inventory is replenished by invisible logistics. This plan works beautifully in stage 1 and stage 2. It even thrives in stage 3. It begins to strain in stage 4. It becomes dangerous in stage 5. It collapses in stage 6. Not because the family was foolish, because the plan was built on continuity. And continuity is the very thing the system must restrict in order to prevent immediate disorder. When the exits are contained, the family cannot withdraw freely. When the currency reprices, the family cannot protect purchasing power fast enough. When debt becomes unpayable, the family must liquidate assets into a falling market or into an inflating currency. And when institutions lose reliability, the family discovers it has no redundancy. This is why most collapses create the same bitter headline after the fact. People say they were robbed. They say their savings were stolen. They say the contract was broken. They're not wrong. But the deeper truth is that the contract was always conditional on institutional capacity. The system did not break its promise out of malice. It broke its promise because it could not honor it at scale without destroying itself. That sentence is where viewers often feel trapped because it suggests there is no clean moral resolution, no single reform that saves everyone, no policy switch that returns the world to stage 1 without cost. And that is correct. Escaping a debt-based system is hard because the system is not merely a set of rules, it is a set of interlocking dependencies. Government finance depends on debt markets. Debt markets depend on central bank credibility. Banks depend on deposits staying calm. Pensions depend on asset prices staying elevated. Households depend on credit. Companies depend on liquidity. The global system depends on payment rails and trust in the unit of account. If you pull one thread too fast, everything tears. This is why reform is resisted. Not because institutions are cartoon villains, because most actors inside the system are protecting the stability that still exists, even if that stability is borrowed from the future. Now we return to America 2025, not as a prophecy, but as a placement in the stage machine described earlier. The transcript frames the situation with numbers that communicate scale and trajectory, a national debt that is historically large, a currency that has seen long-term erosion of purchasing power, a central bank that has expanded its balance sheet dramatically in recent years. But the more important point is not any single statistic. It is the behavior the statistics imply. When obligations rise faster than the political ability to cut spending, pressure builds. When pressure builds, expansion becomes tempting. When expansion persists, strain grows. When strain grows, containment becomes thinkable. When containment becomes thinkable, the public discovers the exits were never guaranteed. This is not a prediction. It is a historically common progression. So the viewer's question changes. Instead of asking when collapse will arrive, the viewer begins asking which stage behaviors are now being rewarded and which stage behaviors are now being punished. Because that is how you locate yourself inside the machine without a crystal ball. And that is the cognitive upgrade this documentary is designed to deliver. Not a map that promises safety, a map that shows why the danger keeps returning. Now we are ready to move from principles and stages into the final layer of the system. The layer that makes the trap feel inescapable. Because hard assets, skills, and networks are not merely good ideas. They are also politically inconvenient. A population that owns assets outright is harder to control through credit. A population with practical skills is harder to trap inside institutional dependence. A population with strong local networks is less reliant on centralized distribution systems. In other words, the very behaviors that protect individuals can reduce the leverage of large institutions. That creates a tension that history repeats too. Systems incentivize behavior that benefits the system, even if it increases fragility for individuals, because the system's priority is not your resilience. The system's priority is its own continuity. And that is why, in the final moments before any reset, the most valuable thing becomes something no brokerage account can display. Autonomy. Autonomy is not rebellion, it is margin. It is the space between your survival and the system's permission to survive. In stable eras, autonomy feels inefficient. Why own something outright when leverage multiplies returns? Why learn a practical skill when a credential buys income? Why build local relationships when institutions deliver everything faster and cheaper? The system trains people to trade autonomy for optimization, and it does so gently through rewards, not threats. Collapse is when the bill for that trade arrives. At that point, autonomy stops being philosophical and becomes logistical. Can you delay selling when prices are collapsing? Can you endure income volatility without missing payments? Can you meet basic needs when supply chains stutter? Can you adapt when rules change faster than contracts can be enforced? This is where many narratives break down, because people want a villain or a fix. They want to know who caused this and how to reverse it. But the system you are inside cannot be reversed without breaking the very structures that still hold society together. A debt-based system cannot unwind debt painlessly. A financialized economy cannot definancialize without destroying asset prices. A centralized distribution network cannot decentralize overnight without shortages. These are not political opinions. They are mechanical constraints. So institutions resist collapse, not out of malice, but out of necessity. They stretch timelines, they smooth losses, they socialize pain, they delay reckoning. And in doing so, they extend the period where paper claims still function enough to keep the machine running. That extension is both mercy and danger. Mercy, because it prevents immediate chaos. Danger, because it trains people to believe continuity will last just a little longer. This is where the documentary makes its final turn. The 5 principles are not instructions for escaping society. They are instructions for reducing fragility inside it. Hard assets do not reject markets. They survive when markets fail. Productive assets do not reject growth. They remain valuable when growth stalls. Eliminating debt does not reject opportunity. It removes forced timing. Skills do not reject specialization. They provide fallback when specialization collapses. Local networks do not reject institutions. They replace them when institutions retreat. None of these moves require certainty. None require a prediction date. None require believing tomorrow will be worse than today. They simply require acknowledging that the system you live in has a history and that history has rules. The most dangerous misunderstanding modern people carry is believing collapse announces itself. It does not. By the time newspapers use the word, the exit doors are already crowded. By the time politicians admit the scale, the rules have already changed. By the time certainty arrives, autonomy is expensive. That is why collapse survivors often sound unspectacular when interviewed later. They did not win. They avoided losing everything. They owned things that did not require permission to matter. They produced value instead of waiting for liquidity. They carried little or no debt into instability. They could trade competence when currency failed. They were embedded in networks that predated the crisis, and because of that, they could endure the reset phase without being crushed by it. This is the final paradox. The behaviors that protect you in collapse also improve your position in stability. Hard assets provide utility. Productive assets generate income. Low debt reduces stress. Skills increase earning power. Networks increase opportunity. They are not pessimistic strategies. They are anti-fragile ones. So why are they so rare? Because they are not maximally rewarded in the expansion phase. They look conservative. They look inefficient. They look like missed upside. And in a culture trained to measure success by short-term gains, that makes them easy to ignore. Until the environment changes, the system does not warn you when the incentives flip. It simply flips them. At that moment, the question is no longer whether you understood the headlines. It is whether your life was positioned for continuity or for reality. This documentary does not end with comfort, because comfort would be dishonest. There is no version of collapse where everyone keeps everything they were promised. There is no reform that preserves all paper claims without cost. There is no reset that feels fair to those who trusted the old rules. But there is clarity. Once you understand the machine, you stop asking whether collapse will happen. You start asking which behaviors the system is rewarding right now, and what those rewards imply about future trade-offs. You stop looking for a savior policy. You start building margin. Because when money fails, systems fail, and promises fail, what remains is not ideology or optimism. What remains is what you own, what you can do, who you know, and how little permission you need to survive. That has been true in every collapse on record. It will be true in the next one, not because history is cruel, but because systems obey incentives until they cannot, and then they reset, quietly, legally, all at once.